In January of 1848, in the foothills of California's Sierra Nevada mountains, a carpenter named James Marshall noticed something shining in the water beside a sawmill under construction. At first glance, it seemed like a small and unremarkable discovery. Yet within a matter of months, news of that discovery would spread across continents. Ships would leave ports around the world. Wagon trains would begin moving west. Fortunes would be won and lost. Entire cities would rise almost overnight. And California would be transformed from a remote frontier into one of the most important regions in the United States. The event would become known as the California Gold Rush. But before we reach that winter morning in 1848, we need to understand the California that existed before gold changed everything. Because the most surprising thing about the gold rush is that it did not create California from nothing. Instead, it accelerated changes that were already underway. Long before miners arrived carrying shovels and gold pans, California was home to thousands of people living in hundreds of communities spread across a remarkably diverse landscape. The California of the early 19th century looked very different from the modern state. There were no major American cities. No railroads crossed the mountains. No telegraph lines connected the Pacific coast to the eastern United States. The region contained vast forests, fertile valleys, rugged mountains, and a coastline stretching for hundreds of miles along the Pacific Ocean. For thousands of years, indigenous peoples had lived throughout these lands. Historians estimate that before sustained European settlement, California may have been home to hundreds of thousands of native people. What made California especially unusual was its diversity. Rather than being dominated by a single culture or language, the region contained numerous distinct societies. Communities developed different traditions, political structures, and ways of life depending on local geography. Along the coast, fishing provided an important source of food. In river valleys, people relied on a combination of hunting, gathering, and trade. In many areas, acorns formed a dietary staple. Native Californians developed sophisticated methods for collecting, processing, and storing acorns, allowing them to support relatively large populations. Trade networks connected distant communities. Shells from coastal regions moved inland. Stone tools traveled across significant distances. Knowledge and cultural traditions spread through these networks as well. Far from being isolated groups living separately from one another, many indigenous communities participated in broader regional systems of exchange. For generations, these societies adapted successfully to California's varied environments. They understood local rivers, forests, seasonal cycles, and wildlife with a level of familiarity that newcomers would struggle to match. Many communities also used controlled burning to manage landscapes. These carefully planned fires reduced undergrowth, encouraged the growth of useful plants, and helped shape ecosystems long before modern environmental science existed. In other words, California was not an untouched wilderness. It was a homeland. A place where people had lived, traded, raised families, and developed cultures over thousands of years. The first Europeans to reach the Pacific coast did not immediately transform California. Spanish explorers sailed along portions of the coastline during the 16th century, but for many years Spain devoted more attention to regions farther south. California remained distant from the centers of Spanish power. The situation began to change during the 18th century. Spanish officials grew increasingly concerned about rival empires. Russia was expanding southward from Alaska. Britain was becoming more active in the Pacific. Spanish leaders worried that if they failed to establish a stronger presence in California, another power might claim the region first. As a result, Spain launched a more determined effort to secure control over the territory. Beginning in 1769, a series of expeditions moved northward into California. These expeditions included soldiers, settlers, and Catholic missionaries. Together, they helped establish the foundations of Spanish California. Among the most influential institutions created during this period were the missions. The mission system was designed to spread Christianity among indigenous populations while strengthening Spain's presence in the region. Over time, a chain of missions stretched along much of California's coast. Many of these missions became important centers of economic activity. They raised livestock, cultivated crops, and produced goods needed by the growing colonial population. For Spanish authorities, the missions served multiple purposes. They promoted religious conversion. They supported settlement. And they helped secure territory that Spain considered strategically important. For indigenous communities, however, the experience was often far more complicated. Some people joined mission communities voluntarily. Others faced pressure to do so. Traditional ways of life were disrupted. New diseases spread through populations that possessed little immunity to them. Demographic losses proved devastating in many regions. The arrival of European diseases represented one of the most profound consequences of colonization throughout the Americas, and California was no exception. During the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the mission system became a defining feature of Spanish California. At the same time, ranching expanded. Large herds of cattle and horses spread across parts of the landscape. Leather and animal hides became important products. Yet despite these developments, California remained a relatively remote frontier within the Spanish Empire. The total non-indigenous population remained small. Settlements were widely separated. Communication with Mexico and Spain was slow. Life moved at a pace very different from the rapid growth that would later characterize the Gold Rush era. Then, in the early 19th century, events occurring far beyond California began to reshape the region once again. Spain's American empire was weakening. Across Latin America, independence movements challenged Spanish authority. One of those movements emerged in Mexico. And when Mexico won its independence from Spain, California entered a new chapter of its history. If you're enjoying this journey through history, consider subscribing to Sleepy America. It helps the channel grow, and it ensures you'll never miss future stories designed to help you relax, unwind, and fall asleep while learning something fascinating from the past. Now, let's return to California in the year 1848, where a small discovery beside a river is about to change history forever. When Mexico achieved independence from Spain in 1821, California became part of a new nation. The transition did not immediately transform daily life across the region. California remained distant from the political centers of power located far to the south in Mexico City. Travel was slow. Communication could take months. Government officials often had considerable freedom in managing local affairs because direct oversight from the national government was difficult. Yet important changes were beginning to unfold. One of the most significant involved the future of the mission system. For decades, the missions had served as religious, economic, and political centers within Spanish California. After independence, many Mexican leaders questioned whether the missions should continue operating in the same way. During the 1830s, the Mexican government moved to secularize the missions. In simple terms, this meant that mission lands and resources would gradually be transferred away from church control. The decision reflected broader political changes taking place throughout Mexico. Leaders hoped to reduce the power of religious institutions and encourage private ownership of land. In practice, the results were complicated. Large portions of former mission lands ended up in the hands of private landowners rather than being distributed widely among indigenous populations. As a result, a new ranching elite emerged. These landowners became known as Californios. The Californios were people of Spanish or Mexican heritage who owned large ranchos across California. Many ranchos covered enormous areas of land. Cattle ranching became the foundation of the regional economy. The image of the California ranchero would become one of the defining symbols of Mexican California. Life on a rancho differed greatly from life in the crowded cities of Europe or the eastern United States. The population remained relatively small. Settlements were scattered. Social life often revolved around ranching families, local communities, religious celebrations, and regional trade. Cattle were especially valuable. At the time, animal hides and tallow represented some of California's most important exports. Hides were sometimes referred to as California banknotes, because they functioned as a major source of wealth. Ships regularly arrived to purchase these products and transport them to distant markets. Despite this trade, California remained economically modest by global standards. Few people imagined that the region would soon become one of the most famous destinations on Earth. During the 1820s and 1830s, visitors from the United States began appearing in increasing numbers. Some arrived aboard merchant vessels. Others entered overland. Most came for trade, exploration, or settlement opportunities. At first, these newcomers represented only a small presence. But their numbers gradually increased. Meanwhile, developments in the United States were creating powerful pressures for westward expansion. The young American Republic had already expanded dramatically since independence. New territories were being settled. New states were joining the Union. Roads, canals, and steamboats improved transportation. Population growth encouraged migration into frontier regions. Many Americans believed that the nation's future lay in the West. This belief eventually became associated with a phrase that remains famous today: manifest destiny. The term is often mentioned in discussions of American history, but it is worth taking a moment to understand what it meant. Manifest destiny was the idea that the United States was destined to expand across the North American continent. Not everyone agreed with this belief. Even at the time, it was controversial. Yet it became highly influential during the 19th century. Supporters argued that expansion would spread American institutions, economic opportunity, and settlement. Critics warned that expansion could lead to conflict, injustice, and political instability. Regardless of whether people supported or opposed it, the idea influenced national policy. As the 1840s approached, increasing numbers of Americans looked westward. The Oregon Country attracted settlers. Texas became a major political issue. Interest in California grew steadily. Reports from travelers described fertile valleys, favorable climates, and economic opportunities. To many Americans living east of the Mississippi River, California seemed distant and mysterious. Maps often showed vast regions about which little was widely known. The journey west remained difficult. There were no transcontinental railroads. A traveler heading toward California faced an enormous undertaking. The overland route required crossing plains, deserts, rivers, and mountains. The sea route around South America was long and expensive. A passage through Panama involved multiple stages of travel and significant hardship. Even so, interest continued growing. One of the Americans who became deeply interested in California was a Swiss-born immigrant named John Sutter. Sutter had lived an adventurous and often uncertain life before arriving in California. Born in what is now Switzerland, he eventually left Europe and traveled to North America. Like many people of his era, he was attracted by the possibilities of frontier regions. After a complicated journey that included travel through multiple countries and territories, Sutter arrived in Mexican California during the late 1830s. He possessed ambition, energy, and a talent for cultivating relationships with local authorities. Mexican officials, eager to encourage settlement in certain areas, granted him land in the Sacramento Valley. The location would prove enormously important. Situated near the junction of major river systems, the area occupied a strategic position within Northern California. Sutter envisioned creating an agricultural and commercial center that could support settlement and trade. To achieve this goal, he established a settlement that became known as Sutter's Fort. Construction began in 1839. The fort served multiple purposes. It functioned as a trading post. It provided protection. It supported agricultural operations. and it became a destination for travelers entering California. Over time, Sutter's Fort emerged as one of the most important locations in the region. American settlers moving west frequently passed through it. Merchants visited it. Workers sought employment there. By the early 1840s, John Sutter had become one of the best-known figures in Northern California. Yet forces much larger than Sutter were beginning to reshape the political future of the entire region. Relations between the United States and Mexico were deteriorating. Disputes over territory were growing. Expansionist sentiment was strengthening within the United States. And within only a few years, California would find itself caught in the middle of an international conflict that would permanently alter its future. That conflict would become known as the Mexican-American War. And it would set the stage for one of the most consequential discoveries in American history. By the mid-1840s, tensions between the United States and Mexico had reached a breaking point. The two nations disagreed over territory, borders, and the future of North America. What began as a diplomatic dispute gradually moved toward war. For California, the consequences would be profound. At the time, California was still part of Mexico. Yet Mexican authority in the region was often limited by distance. The territory lay hundreds of miles from the country's political center. Communication was slow. Military resources were limited. Local officials frequently had to make decisions without immediate guidance from Mexico City. Meanwhile, the number of American settlers entering Mexican territory continued to grow. Some settled in Texas. Others moved into the Oregon country. Still others found their way to California. Many came seeking land, opportunity, and a fresh start. Their presence increased the influence of the United States in regions that Mexico considered its own. In 1845, the United States annexed Texas. Mexico objected strongly. Disagreements over the Texas border soon escalated into armed conflict. In 1846, the Mexican-American War officially began. Although the war is often remembered for battles fought farther east, events in California also played an important role. At the beginning of the conflict, California remained a distant frontier. News traveled slowly. People often learned about major developments weeks or even months after they occurred. This created uncertainty. Residents frequently acted on rumors, incomplete information, or expectations about what might happen next. In June of 1846, a group of American settlers in Northern California launched what became known as the Bear Flag Revolt. The rebels declared an independent California republic and raised a homemade flag featuring a bear. The episode lasted only a short time. Within weeks, American military forces arrived and assumed control. The brief republic disappeared almost as quickly as it had emerged. Yet the event reflected the changing political realities of the region. American influence was growing rapidly. Military operations continued throughout California. United States naval forces captured key coastal settlements. American troops moved into important population centers. Mexican resistance existed, but the balance of power gradually shifted. By early 1847, most of California was effectively under American control. The broader war continued, but the future of California was becoming increasingly clear. For many residents, however, daily life remained focused on more immediate concerns. People still managed ranches. Merchants still conducted business. Travelers still crossed the frontier. And individuals like John Sutter continued pursuing their ambitions in the Sacramento Valley. Sutter had built his fort into a significant center of activity. Farmers supplied food. Workers maintained operations. Traders moved goods through the region. Yet success created new challenges. One of the largest was labor. Northern California was growing. Demand for lumber increased. Buildings, farms, and settlements all required wood. Sutter needed a reliable source of timber if he hoped to expand his enterprises. To address this need, he entered into an arrangement with a skilled carpenter and millwright named James Wilson Marshall. Marshall was an experienced builder. Like many people living in frontier regions, he had traveled widely and worked in various occupations. He possessed practical skills that were highly valuable in a developing territory. Sutter and Marshall agreed to construct a sawmill in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains. The chosen location lay along the South Fork of the American River, roughly 45 miles northeast of Sutter's fort. The site offered flowing water capable of powering machinery. Construction began during 1847. Workers labored to complete the project before the mill entered operation. At the time, neither Sutter nor Marshall imagined that the sawmill would become famous throughout the world. Their concern was lumber. Nothing more. Yet history often unfolds in unexpected ways. While Sutter and Marshall focused on timber production, the political future of California was being decided elsewhere. In February 1848, representatives of the United States and Mexico signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The treaty officially ended the Mexican-American War. Under its terms, Mexico ceded a vast amount of territory to the United States. The Mexican cession included present-day California, Nevada, Utah, and portions of several other states. The transfer dramatically increased the size of the United States. It also raised important political questions. Would slavery expand into these new territories? How would they be governed? Who would settle them? At the moment the treaty was signed, few people realized that another event had already occurred in California. An event that would soon overshadow almost everything else. The timing was extraordinary. Just days before the treaty was finalized, James Marshall was inspecting work at the sawmill. As part of the construction process, water flowed through a channel known as a mill race. The moving water helped power machinery, but it also washed away loose material from the bottom of the channel. On the morning of January 24, 1848, Marshall noticed several metallic particles lying in the water. They caught his attention because they reflected light differently than ordinary stones. Curious, he picked them up and examined them more closely. Marshall suspected that he might have found gold. Yet he was not immediately certain. Gold discoveries carried enormous implications. Extraordinary claims required verification. Marshall conducted a series of simple tests. He hammered the metal. He examined its color. He observed how it reacted under different conditions. The results strengthened his suspicion. The material appeared to be gold. Marshall soon informed John Sutter. The two men understood that such a discovery could change everything. At first, they attempted to keep the news quiet. This decision was understandable. Sutter wanted workers to remain focused on his businesses. If people abandoned their jobs in search of gold, his operations could collapse. Marshall also recognized the potential consequences. Neither man wanted chaos. For a brief period, secrecy seemed possible. The sawmill remained isolated. California's population was still relatively small. Communication remained slow. Perhaps, they hoped, the discovery could remain limited to a handful of trusted individuals. History, however, had other plans. Because once news of gold begins to spread, keeping it secret becomes almost impossible. And over the next few months, California would begin a transformation unlike anything the region had ever experienced. For several weeks after the discovery at the sawmill, John Sutter and James Marshall tried to limit the spread of information. Their efforts were understandable. Sutter had spent years building his agricultural empire in the Sacramento Valley. He owned land, livestock, workshops, and trading operations. His success depended on labor. If workers abandoned their jobs to search for gold, everything he had built could be placed at risk. Marshall shared similar concerns. The sawmill itself still needed to be completed. A gold rush was the last thing either man wanted. Yet secrets are difficult to keep in a frontier society. Workers at the mill noticed unusual activity. Rumors circulated. Small quantities of gold changed hands. People began talking. The story spread from one settlement to another. At first, many Californians were skeptical. The region had witnessed rumors before. Extraordinary claims often turned out to be exaggerated. Still, curiosity grew. Some individuals traveled to the mill to investigate for themselves. Others tested nearby streams and riverbanks. Increasingly, they found evidence that the rumors were true. Gold was indeed present. and in some locations, it could be collected with relatively simple tools. As word spread throughout California, a gradual migration began. Workers left farms. Soldiers deserted military posts. Sailors abandoned ships. Shopkeepers temporarily closed businesses. People from different occupations headed toward the gold-bearing regions of the Sierra Nevada foothills. The effect on local communities was immediate. Labor shortages appeared almost everywhere. One observer later remarked that nearly every form of work except gold mining seemed to stop. Although that statement was somewhat exaggerated, it captured the mood of the moment. Gold dominated attention. The situation proved especially damaging for John Sutter. Ironically, the discovery that occurred on his land threatened to destroy the economic system he had spent years creating. Workers departed. Employees abandoned projects. Agricultural operations suffered. Livestock wandered unattended. Equipment remained unfinished. Sutter had hoped to benefit from California's future growth. Instead, the gold rush would largely undermine his personal fortunes. His experience became one of the great ironies of the era. The man whose property helped launch the gold rush would never become one of its great beneficiaries. During the spring of 1848, news continued spreading across California. Yet the rest of the world remained largely unaware. The United States had only recently acquired the territory. The population was still small. No transcontinental telegraph existed. Communication with the eastern United States remained slow. As a result, months passed before reliable reports reached major American cities. When they finally did, many readers found them difficult to believe. Stories of gold discoveries had appeared before in various parts of the world. Most produced excitement, but not necessarily enormous wealth. Editors approached the California reports cautiously. Government officials also wanted confirmation. One of the most important figures in verifying the discovery was Colonel Richard Mason, the military governor of California. Mason traveled to the gold fields during the summer of 1848. What he observed convinced him that the reports were genuine. He witnessed miners recovering gold from streams. He collected evidence. He estimated the scale of production. Most importantly, he prepared official reports describing what was happening. These reports would prove influential. At roughly the same time, another man was preparing to play a major role in spreading the news. His name was Samuel Brannan. Brannan is not as widely remembered today as John Sutter or James Marshall, yet he became one of the most important figures in the early gold rush. A merchant, publisher, and entrepreneur, Brannan possessed a keen understanding of opportunity. When he learned about the discovery, he quickly recognized its significance. Unlike many others, he understood that enormous wealth could be generated not only by finding gold but also by supplying those who searched for it. Brannan purchased large quantities of mining equipment and supplies. Then he helped publicize the discovery. According to popular accounts, he walked through the streets of San Francisco holding a bottle filled with gold dust and announcing that gold had been found on the American River. Whether every detail of these stories is accurate remains debated, but the broader reality is clear. Brannan enthusiastically promoted the discovery. His actions helped fuel public excitement. As interest increased, San Francisco itself began changing. In 1848, San Francisco was still a relatively small settlement. Only a few years earlier, it had been known as Yerba Buena. Its population remained modest. Its future seemed uncertain. The gold rush changed that almost immediately. People arriving from surrounding areas passed through the town. Ships brought newcomers and supplies. Businesses expanded to meet growing demand. The settlement became a gateway to the gold fields. Meanwhile, reports continued traveling eastward. Newspapers published stories about discoveries in California. Some articles expressed skepticism. Others embraced the reports enthusiastically. The turning point came late in 1848. In December, President James K. Polk addressed Congress. Polk had received official confirmation regarding the discoveries. In his message, he acknowledged the existence of substantial gold deposits in California. This endorsement carried tremendous weight. If the President of the United States publicly confirmed the reports, many Americans concluded that the stories must be true. The effect was dramatic. Interest exploded almost overnight. Throughout the eastern United States, people began discussing California. Newspapers published maps. Travelers gathered information about routes westward. Merchants calculated potential profits. Young men dreamed of fortunes. Families debated whether relocation might be worthwhile. The timing added to the excitement. Economic opportunities varied across different parts of the country. For many people, the possibility of striking gold represented a chance to improve their circumstances dramatically. Some hoped to escape debt. Others wanted adventure. Many simply desired a better future. Whatever their reasons, increasing numbers of people began planning journeys to California. Yet reaching California in 1849 was not easy. There were no direct rail connections. No highways crossed the continent. A prospective miner faced a choice among several difficult routes. Each carried risks. Each demanded significant time and resources. And each would test the endurance of those who attempted it. Some would travel overland across thousands of miles of frontier. Others would sail around the southern tip of South America. Still others would cross the jungles and rivers of Panama in search of a faster route. Collectively, these travelers would become famous as the 49ers. They would help create one of the largest voluntary migrations in American history. And their journeys would become some of the most remarkable stories of the entire gold rush era. Before they could search for gold, however, they first had to reach California. And that journey was often every bit as challenging as the mining itself. By the beginning of 1849, California had become the subject of countless conversations across the United States. In cities along the Atlantic coast, people discussed gold in taverns, newspapers, boarding houses, and places of business. In small farming communities hundreds of miles inland, the topic spread just as quickly. Letters were passed from hand to hand. Newspaper articles were read aloud. Rumors mixed with facts. Stories grew larger with every retelling. Some people dismissed the reports. Others became fascinated. But for thousands of Americans, the question was no longer whether gold existed in California. The question was whether they should go. Deciding to leave for California was not a simple choice. Popular images often portray 49ers as young adventurers eager for excitement. Some certainly fit that description. But many were ordinary people making difficult calculations about their future. A farmer in Ohio might spend years working land that produced only modest profits. A carpenter in New York could face intense competition for jobs. A shopkeeper might struggle with debt. California seemed to offer something extraordinary. The possibility, however uncertain, that a person could acquire wealth far more quickly than through years of ordinary labor. Yet the decision involved enormous risks. Reaching California required money. Equipment had to be purchased. Travel expenses had to be paid. Families would be separated for months or even years. There was no guarantee of success. In fact, many people understood that failure was entirely possible. Nevertheless, the opportunity proved irresistible. Some men left wives and children behind, intending to return after earning a fortune. Others traveled with brothers, cousins, neighbors, or lifelong friends. A smaller number attempted the journey as complete family groups. In communities across America, farewells became increasingly common. People sold property. They settled debts. They prepared wills. Some wrote letters to relatives in case they never returned. The scale of commitment was remarkable. A person traveling to California in 1849 often knew that he might never see home again. One of the most valuable sources historians possess today comes from letters and diaries written during this period. These accounts reveal a mixture of emotions. Excitement and anxiety existed side by side. Hope competed with uncertainty. Many travelers genuinely believed they stood on the threshold of a life-changing opportunity. Yet they also recognized the dangers ahead. Before leaving, prospective miners needed supplies. And the list was extensive. A person traveling overland might purchase a wagon, oxen, tools, clothing, blankets, cooking equipment, firearms, ammunition, medicine, and months of food. Flour, bacon, beans, coffee, sugar, and dried foods were common purchases. Prices increased in many communities as demand surged. Merchants quickly recognized that thousands of people were preparing for the same journey. In some towns, the gold rush produced economic booms long before anyone reached California. Blacksmiths repaired wagons. General stores sold equipment. Livestock dealers supplied animals. Transportation companies advertised services. Entire local economies began benefiting from migration. This pattern would become one of the defining characteristics of the gold rush. Again and again, people often earned more money supplying miners than mining itself. By spring, major departure points along the Missouri River filled with activity. Independence, St. Joseph, and nearby settlements became crowded with emigrants making final preparations. Contemporary observers described roads packed with wagons. Camps stretched across open ground. Livestock grazed nearby. Conversations centered on routes, weather, supplies, and rumors from California. No one knew exactly what awaited them. Many had never traveled more than a few dozen miles from their birthplace. Now they were preparing to cross an entire continent. Once the journey began, daily life settled into a routine. Travelers usually rose before sunrise. Breakfast had to be prepared. Animals needed attention. Wagons required inspection. Only after these tasks were completed could the day's travel begin. Most days involved long hours of walking. Contrary to popular images, many emigrants did not ride inside wagons. Roads were often too rough. Space was limited. Walking conserved room for supplies. As a result, travelers frequently spent much of the day on foot beside their wagons. The distances accumulated slowly. A typical wagon train might travel 15 or 20 miles in a day. Some days were better. Others were worse. Progress depended on weather, terrain, livestock, and luck. At night, camps formed. Meals were prepared. Stories were exchanged. People repaired equipment and discussed plans for the next day. These evenings often provided the only opportunity to rest. Yet even in camp, concerns remained. Disease represented a constant threat. So did accidents. A broken wheel could delay an entire group. A lost animal created serious problems. A serious injury might end the journey completely. Travelers soon discovered that the West was larger than they had imagined. Week after week, the horizon seemed endless. Grasslands stretched in every direction. Rivers interrupted progress. Storms arrived without warning. Dust covered clothing, equipment, and food. The journey demanded patience as much as endurance. Yet despite the hardships, many emigrants later described moments of wonder. Some had never seen landscapes on such a scale. They encountered enormous plains, distant mountain ranges, vast skies, and wildlife unlike anything they had known in the East. The American continent revealed itself gradually as they moved westward. For many travelers, the journey became one of the defining experiences of their lives. And still, California remained far away. Month after month, they advanced toward a destination most had never seen. They carried dreams of gold in their minds. But few understood that the greatest challenge was not finding gold. The greatest challenge was simply reaching the gold fields alive. As the migration continued through 1849, thousands pushed westward across the continent. Yet many others looked at the long overland route and chose a different path entirely. Instead of crossing plains and mountains, they would trust their fortunes to the sea. Their voyage would take them thousands of miles across oceans, around violent storms, and through some of the most isolated waters on Earth. And for many of them, the journey to California would prove every bit as memorable as the gold rush itself. By the summer of 1849, thousands of men had finally reached California. Some had crossed the Great Plains. Some had sailed around Cape Horn. Others had endured the heat, mud, and disease of the Panama route. Their journeys were different, but many of them shared the same destination: the mining camps of Northern California. For many newcomers, the first sight of a mining camp was surprising. Newspapers had often focused on gold itself. They described discoveries, fortunes, and opportunities. What they described less often was daily life. The reality was that most miners spent far more time living than finding gold. To understand the gold rush, it helps to spend a day with an ordinary 49er. Not a famous man. Not a wealthy merchant. Not a future politician. Just an ordinary miner hoping to improve his future. His day often began before sunrise. Canvas tents and rough wooden shelters offered limited protection from the cold night air. In the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, mornings could be chilly even during warmer months. A miner might wake on a simple blanket spread over the ground. Some were fortunate enough to own a cot. Many were not. The first task was usually breakfast. Food varied depending on location and income. Coffee was common when available. Bread, bacon, beans, dried meat, and simple biscuits appeared frequently. Fresh food was harder to obtain. Fruit and vegetables were often expensive in remote camps. A miner who had recently arrived with supplies might eat reasonably well. Months later, conditions were often different. Prices in the mining regions could shock newcomers. Eggs, flour, and meat sometimes cost several times what they would have cost in the eastern United States. The reason was simple. Everything had to be transported. Every sack of flour, every tool, every barrel of food had traveled a long distance before reaching the camp. After breakfast, work began. Most miners headed toward rivers, streams, or claims shortly after daylight appeared. The work was physical. Gold did not leap into a miner's hands. Earth had to be dug. Gravel had to be lifted. Sediment had to be washed. Tools had to be carried and maintained. Many miners spent hours standing in cold water. Others worked beneath the hot California sun. The labor could be exhausting. Hands became rough. Clothing wore out quickly. Boots were constantly tested by rocks, mud, and water. Yet despite the hardships, the work contained an element of anticipation. Every shovel of earth might contain something valuable. Every pan might reveal a few bright flakes. That possibility kept people moving. The mining camps were filled with conversations about discoveries. Someone had reportedly found a rich claim nearby. Someone else had recovered an impressive amount of gold the previous week. Stories spread rapidly. Not all of them were true. But they gave miners hope. Around midday, many workers paused briefly for food. Lunch was often simple. There was little time for elaborate meals. A miner might sit beside a stream, eat bread and salted meat, drink coffee, and return to work. The landscape around him could be beautiful. Pine-covered hills rose above many camps. Rivers wound through valleys. Wildlife remained abundant in some regions. Yet miners often had little opportunity to appreciate the scenery. Their attention focused on work. Every hour spent resting felt like an hour not spent searching. During the afternoon, the routine continued. Digging. Carrying. Washing. Sorting. Examining. Repeating the process again and again. Some days produced encouraging results. Other days produced almost nothing. This uncertainty shaped the emotional life of the camps. Success and disappointment often existed side by side. One miner might celebrate a promising discovery. Another might quietly wonder whether he had made a terrible mistake by coming west. As evening approached, work gradually slowed. The camps became social spaces once again. Fires were lit. Meals were prepared. Stories were exchanged. Men from different states and different countries gathered together after long days of labor. A visitor could hear accents from New York, Georgia, Missouri, Ireland, Germany, France, Chile, Mexico, and many other places. Few regions in the world brought together such a diverse collection of people. The conversations reflected this diversity. Some discussed mining techniques. Others discussed politics. Many spoke about home. Homesickness was common. A surprising number of miners spent their evenings writing letters. They wrote to wives, parents, brothers, sisters, friends, These letters reveal a side of the gold rush that newspaper headlines rarely captured. They reveal loneliness, uncertainty, hope, determination. A miner might describe opportunities while quietly omitting his failures. He might reassure his family even when he was worried himself. Weeks or months could pass before receiving a reply. Communication moved slowly across the continent. Entertainment was limited but important. Some camps organized card games. Others featured musicians. Storytelling was common. Newspapers circulated when available. A few miners read books carried from home. Yet many simply rested. Physical labor left little energy at the end of the day. Sleep often arrived quickly. Before falling asleep, however, many miners shared one final habit. They imagined the future. Some imagined returning home wealthy. Some imagined purchasing farms. Others dreamed of opening businesses. These dreams were powerful. In truth, dreams may have been nearly as important to the gold rush as gold itself. They helped people endure difficult days. They encouraged persistence. They gave meaning to sacrifice. Yet beneath those dreams, another reality remained. Most miners were not becoming rich. And as the months passed, many began noticing that some people seemed to be prospering far more consistently than those searching the rivers themselves. When most people imagine the California gold rush, they picture miners standing in rivers with pans in their hands. The image is familiar. It appears in paintings, books, and films. Yet it tells only part of the story. The gold rush was not built entirely by miners. Nor was it built entirely by men. From the earliest days of the rush, women played important roles in the creation of California's new society. Their experiences were often very different from those of the prospectors who filled newspaper headlines. And in many cases, they discovered opportunities that miners overlooked. During the first years of the gold rush, women were relatively rare in many parts of California. The imbalance was dramatic. In some mining regions, men outnumbered women by dozens or even hundreds to one. This unusual situation affected nearly every aspect of daily life. Simple services that might have been taken for granted elsewhere became valuable businesses. Cooking, laundry, sewing, lodging, childcare, hospitality. Wherever large numbers of men gathered, demand for these services grew rapidly. Some women arrived in California alongside husbands and families. Others came independently. A number of them quickly recognized that mining itself was not the only path to prosperity. In fact, for many women, providing services proved more reliable than searching for gold. Consider the simple act of preparing meals. Thousands of miners spent long days working in streams and digging claims. Most had neither the time nor the desire to cook elaborate food after exhausting labor. Restaurants, boarding houses, and food businesses became increasingly important. Women who operated such establishments could earn steady income from customers regardless of whether those customers found gold. Laundry offered another opportunity. Mining was dirty work. Clothing became stained, torn, and worn. Clean garments were highly valued. In some camps, people were willing to pay surprisingly high prices for laundry services. As a result, washing clothes sometimes produced more predictable profits than mining itself. This pattern appeared repeatedly throughout California. The people who served miners often enjoyed more stable earnings than the miners they served. One of the most remarkable examples involved women entrepreneurs. Some arrived with little money. Yet they built successful businesses through hard work and practical judgment. Boarding houses expanded into hotels. Small shops expanded into larger enterprises. In a rapidly growing economy, opportunities existed almost everywhere. These opportunities were not equally available to everyone. Challenges remained substantial. Travel to California was difficult. Living conditions could be harsh. Housing shortages created problems. Prices remained high. Women frequently faced legal and social restrictions that limited their choices. Yet despite these obstacles, many demonstrated extraordinary resilience. Their stories reveal another side of the gold rush. A side focused less on sudden fortune and more on long-term success. Family life also began changing California. During the earliest phase of the rush, many settlements resembled temporary camps. Large numbers of unmarried men arrived hoping to stay only long enough to find gold. As wives, children, and extended families appeared, communities started evolving. Schools became more important. Churches expanded. Permanent homes replaced some temporary shelters. Businesses increasingly planned for long-term growth. The presence of families encouraged stability. A town filled entirely with transient miners could disappear quickly when local deposits declined. A town with families, schools, businesses, and institutions was more likely to endure. In this sense, women played a crucial role in transforming California from a mining frontier into a society. The process was gradual. It occurred differently in different regions. Yet throughout the state, similar patterns emerged. Temporary camps became communities. Communities became towns. Towns became cities. The change required more than gold. It required people willing to build lasting lives. The experiences of women during the gold rush varied enormously. Some lived in growing cities such as San Francisco. Others lived in isolated mining settlements. Some managed businesses. Others worked within households. A few accumulated considerable wealth. Many simply worked to support themselves and their families. Their backgrounds were equally diverse. American women arrived from eastern states. Mexican women had already lived in California before the rush began. European immigrants contributed to expanding communities. Women from Latin America, China, and many other regions became part of California's developing society. This diversity reflected the broader character of the gold rush itself. California was becoming a meeting place for people from around the world. Different languages could be heard in markets and streets. Different customs appeared side by side. New cultural influences shaped daily life. Not all interactions were harmonious. Prejudice and discrimination existed. Competition created tensions. Yet the population's diversity became one of California's defining characteristics. Historians sometimes note that the people who built lasting fortunes during the gold rush were often not those who found the most gold. Instead, they were frequently individuals who identified needs and met them effectively. Many women fit this pattern. They recognized opportunities. They adapted to changing conditions. They created businesses and institutions that outlasted the mining boom itself. Their contributions remind us that the gold rush was larger than the search for precious metal. It was also the story of a society being created in real time. And as that society expanded, another reality became increasingly clear. Some people were consistently succeeding. Others were consistently struggling. The difference often had less to do with luck than many miners wanted to believe. In California, the greatest fortunes were not always being found in rivers. Quite often, they were being built in stores, warehouses, hotels, transportation companies, and businesses that supplied the people still searching for gold. As the months passed, a curious pattern began to emerge across California. Miners continued searching rivers and hillsides for gold. They worked long hours. They endured difficult conditions. They accepted enormous uncertainty. Yet some of the wealthiest people in California were not miners at all. This realization came slowly. At first, many newcomers remained convinced that the next rich claim might change everything. A disappointing week could be followed by an extraordinary discovery. Hope remained powerful. But by 1850 and 1851, increasing numbers of people began noticing that the most reliable fortunes were often being made elsewhere. One of the best-known examples was Samuel Brannan. When news of the gold discovery first began spreading, Brannan understood something important. Thousands of people were going to rush toward the mining regions. Those people would need equipment. They would need food. They would need clothing. They would need tools. Instead of searching for gold himself, Brannan focused on supplying those who did. He purchased large quantities of mining equipment and sold them to eager prospectors. As demand exploded, his profits grew. In later years, Brannan became one of the wealthiest men in California. His story illustrates a lesson repeated throughout the gold rush. A gold rush creates opportunities not only for miners but for everyone who serves miners. Merchants often prospered. A store owner who stocked the right goods could earn steady income day after day. Unlike miners, merchants did not depend on luck buried beneath the ground. They depended on customers. And California had no shortage of customers. Transportation operators benefited as well. People needed ships. They needed freight services. They needed wagons and pack animals. Every item reaching the gold fields represented an opportunity for someone along the supply chain. Hotel owners, restaurant operators, blacksmiths, carpenters, and bankers all participated in the expanding economy. Many earned more predictable incomes than prospectors. This did not mean that miners never succeeded. Some certainly did. Stories of successful discoveries were real. A fortunate miner could still find a rich claim. When that happened, the rewards could be extraordinary. Newspaper accounts often celebrated such events. Crowds gathered around successful miners. Rumors spread rapidly. Fresh waves of prospectors rushed toward promising districts. Yet these stories sometimes created misleading impressions. Because people heard far more about successes than failures. Human beings have always been drawn to extraordinary outcomes. A miner who discovered a fortune became famous. A miner who spent 2 years earning very little rarely attracted attention. The result was a distorted picture of reality. Most miners occupied a middle ground. They neither became rich nor suffered complete ruin. They worked hard. They earned something. They survived. But they did not achieve the dramatic wealth promised by popular legends. Diaries and letters revealed this reality repeatedly. Some miners described earning enough to justify their efforts. Others expressed frustration. Many continued searching because they believed success might still arrive tomorrow. Hope remained a valuable resource, even when gold was scarce. Not everyone could afford to continue indefinitely. Mining required supplies. Food cost money. Tools wore out. Clothing needed replacement. A miner who failed to earn enough eventually faced difficult decisions. Some sought wage labor. Others joined larger mining operations. Many abandoned prospecting entirely. California offered alternatives. Growing towns required workers. Businesses required employees. Farms required labor. Opportunities existed beyond the rivers. For some people, leaving mining behind became the smartest decision they ever made. One former prospector might become a successful merchant. Another might establish a transportation business. A third might purchase land and begin farming. The gold rush economy rewarded adaptability. Those who adjusted to changing circumstances often performed better than those who pursued the same strategy year after year. This lesson appeared repeatedly throughout California. The dream that brought people west was often simple. Find gold. Become wealthy. Return home. Reality was usually more complicated. Many individuals who ultimately prospered achieved success in ways they never expected when they first arrived. They adapted their plans. They responded to opportunities. They built businesses instead of searching streams. They invested rather than prospected. They stayed rather than returning home. At the same time, some stories ended in disappointment. Savings disappeared. Claims failed. Health declined. Families waited for success that never came. Historical records contain countless examples of people who sacrificed years pursuing wealth that remained elusive. Their experiences are just as important as the stories of success. They remind us that the gold rush involved risk. Genuine risk. People were making decisions without knowing the outcome. Looking backward, it is easy to focus on the winners. But the participants themselves lived with uncertainty every day. In that sense, California resembled many other boom regions throughout history. Opportunity existed. So did danger. Ambition existed. So did disappointment. The balance between them varied from person to person. Yet even those who failed to become wealthy contributed to something larger. They helped create the population, economy, and infrastructure of a rapidly growing state. Their labor helped build California. And as the population expanded, another challenge emerged. Wealth attracted not only honest workers and entrepreneurs. It also attracted thieves, gamblers, speculators, and individuals eager to exploit the chaos of a society growing faster than its institutions. In places such as San Francisco, maintaining order became increasingly difficult. The city was becoming rich. It was becoming influential. But it was also becoming one of the most turbulent places in the American West. In 1848, San Francisco was a small settlement on the edge of a vast bay. Only a few years later, it had become one of the fastest-growing cities in the world. The transformation was so rapid that visitors often struggled to believe what they were seeing. New buildings appeared constantly. Ships crowded the harbor. Businesses opened almost overnight. People arrived from every corner of the globe. The city seemed to operate in a permanent state of motion. Yet explosive growth created problems as well as opportunities. The institutions that normally helped maintain order could not expand as quickly as the population. Laws existed. Courts existed. Officials existed. But all of them struggled to keep pace with change. In many respects, San Francisco was still a frontier city. And frontier cities often experience periods of instability. The harbor provided one of the clearest examples of the chaos. Hundreds of ships arrived carrying passengers and supplies. Many crews had sailed for months to reach California. But once they arrived, a surprising thing often happened. Sailors abandoned their vessels. The temptation was difficult to resist. Why continue working aboard a ship when gold fields promised wealth? Captains frequently complained that crews disappeared within days or even hours of reaching port. As a result, numerous ships sat idle in the harbor. Some remained there for years. A few were eventually converted into warehouses, hotels, offices, and storage facilities. Visitors sometimes described the waterfront as a forest of abandoned masts. The scene symbolized the extraordinary disruption created by the gold rush. Labor shortages affected nearly every industry. Employers struggled to retain workers. Wages remained high. People constantly searched for better opportunities. This mobility helped create prosperity. It also contributed to instability. Crime became a growing concern. The reasons were not difficult to understand. Large amounts of gold circulated through the economy. Many people carried valuable property. Population growth overwhelmed existing institutions. Under such conditions, theft, fraud, and other crimes became increasingly common. Newspapers frequently reported robberies. Merchants worried about security. Residents debated how best to protect themselves and their communities. Gambling represented another visible feature of city life. To many newcomers, gambling seemed almost unavoidable. Card games appeared in hotels, saloons, and gathering places. Some individuals viewed gambling as entertainment. Others regarded it as a serious problem. Fortunes could change hands quickly. A successful miner might lose months of earnings during a single evening. Stories circulated about spectacular wins and devastating losses. Like the search for gold itself, gambling combined hope, risk, and uncertainty. Not surprisingly, it attracted many participants. Alcohol consumption also played an important role in social life. Saloons multiplied throughout California. They served as meeting places where people exchanged news, discussed business, and sought relief from difficult conditions. Some establishments became important centers of community interaction. Others developed reputations for disorder. The line between opportunity and trouble often remained thin. Meanwhile, city officials struggled to establish effective systems of governance. Police forces were limited. Courts faced heavy workloads. Corruption sometimes appeared. Many residents felt that existing institutions were not responding adequately to public concerns. These frustrations eventually contributed to the formation of groups known as vigilance committees. The name reflected their purpose. Members believed they needed to take a more active role in maintaining order. The most famous committees emerged in San Francisco during the 1850s. Supporters argued that official institutions were too weak, or too corrupt to deal effectively with crime. Critics worried about the dangers of citizens assuming powers normally reserved for courts and governments. The debate revealed an important tension. How should law and order be maintained in a rapidly growing society? The question was not unique to California. Frontier regions throughout history have confronted similar challenges. Yet the speed of San Francisco's growth made the issue especially visible. The vigilance committees became powerful organizations. They investigated suspected criminals. They organized patrols. They sometimes imposed punishments outside the normal legal system. Many residents supported these actions. Others considered them troubling. Historians continue discussing their legacy. Some view the committees as responses to genuine problems. Others emphasize the risks associated with extralegal authority. Both perspectives help illuminate the complexities of the period. Regardless of how one interprets the committees, their existence reveals how extraordinary conditions had become. San Francisco was attempting to transform itself from a frontier boomtown into a functioning city. That process was rarely smooth. Yet despite disorder, growth continued. Banks expanded. Warehouses multiplied. Roads improved. Businesses invested for the future. The city gradually developed stronger institutions. The chaotic years did not last forever. Over time, greater stability emerged. Many boomtowns disappeared once nearby resources declined. San Francisco followed a different path. Its location, harbor, and commercial importance allowed it to become far more than a temporary gold rush settlement. It evolved into the principal city of the American Pacific Coast. In many ways, San Francisco's story reflected the larger story of California itself. Rapid growth, extraordinary opportunity, frequent uncertainty, and constant adaptation. By the early 1850s, however, California's transformation was no longer being shaped only by Americans arriving from the eastern states. Across the Pacific Ocean, another great migration was underway. Thousands of Chinese immigrants were beginning their own journeys toward what many called the Gold Mountain. Their arrival would permanently change the history of California and the American West. Not everyone who dreamed of reaching California in 1849 was willing to spend 4 or 5 months crossing the continent by wagon. For many people living along the Atlantic coast, the overland journey seemed too long, too uncertain, or too physically demanding. Others simply lived closer to major ports than to the western trails. As a result, thousands chose a very different route. They would travel to California by sea. At first glance, the decision appeared sensible. A ship could carry far more supplies than a wagon. Passengers did not need to walk across deserts or mountains. Food and water could be loaded before departure. Yet ocean travel introduced a different set of risks. The sea had its own hardships. And for many 49ers, the voyage became an endurance test unlike anything they had previously experienced. The longest route involved sailing around Cape Horn, the southern tip of South America. Before the construction of the Panama Canal many decades later, this was one of the few ways to travel entirely by water from the eastern United States to California. The journey was immense. A ship departing from New York or Boston would sail south through the Atlantic Ocean. It would continue past the coast of South America. Then it would round Cape Horn before turning north again along the Pacific coast. Depending on weather and conditions, the voyage often lasted 4 to 8 months. Some trips took even longer. To modern travelers accustomed to airplanes and highways, such distances can be difficult to imagine. A person leaving New York might spend half a year at sea before seeing California. During that time, the ship became an entire world. Passengers ate, slept, worked, argued, socialized, and worried together in a confined space. Privacy was limited. Comfort was often minimal. Conditions varied greatly depending on the vessel. Wealthier travelers sometimes secured relatively comfortable accommodations. Most did not. Many passengers occupied crowded quarters below deck. Ventilation could be poor. Food quality often declined as the voyage progressed. Fresh fruits and vegetables disappeared early. Salted meat, hard bread, beans, and preserved foods became dietary staples. Drinking water had to be carefully managed. Seasickness was common, especially among people with little previous experience on the ocean. For some passengers, the first weeks were miserable. Yet boredom eventually became an equally significant challenge. Day after day, the horizon appeared unchanged. Water stretched in every direction. Time seemed to slow. Travelers read books, played games, wrote letters, kept journals, and shared stories in an effort to pass the long hours. Some studied maps of California. Others discussed mining strategies. Many spent months imagining the fortunes they hoped to find. The anticipation became part of the experience. Every passenger carried a version of California in his imagination. For some, it was a land of easy wealth. For others, it represented independence. For still others, it was simply an opportunity unavailable at home. These dreams helped sustain people through difficult voyages. The greatest challenge often arrived near Cape Horn itself. Sailors had feared the region for centuries. The waters where the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans meet are among the most dangerous on Earth. Powerful winds sweep across the Southern Ocean. Massive waves can develop with little warning. Storms are frequent. Temperatures are cold. Ice occasionally presents additional hazards. Captains approaching Cape Horn understood that conditions could change rapidly. Ships might spend days battling rough seas. Passengers described violent motion, crashing waves, and constant uncertainty. During storms, ordinary activities became difficult. Walking across a deck required caution. Sleep was interrupted. Meals were challenging. Even experienced sailors respected the dangers of the region. Yet despite these risks, thousands successfully completed the voyage. When ships finally entered California waters, passengers often felt enormous relief. Months after leaving home, they could finally see the destination that had occupied their thoughts for so long. But reaching California did not necessarily mean reaching the gold fields. Many ships arrived in San Francisco Bay carrying hundreds of eager fortune seekers. What they encountered surprised them. The town they expected to find barely resembled a stable city. Instead, they discovered a place overwhelmed by rapid growth. Labor shortages affected nearly every occupation. Prices were extraordinarily high. Buildings appeared almost as quickly as they were needed. Opportunity seemed visible everywhere. Yet before we explore San Francisco itself, we must consider a third route to California. For many travelers, it appeared to offer the best balance between speed and practicality. Rather than crossing the continent or sailing around South America, they chose to travel through Panama. On a map, the idea looked simple. The Isthmus of Panama formed a narrow strip of land connecting North and South America. Travelers could sail from the eastern United States to the Caribbean side of Panama. They could then cross the isthmus overland before boarding another ship bound for California. In theory, this route reduced travel time significantly. In practice, it introduced an entirely different set of difficulties. The tropical climate challenged newcomers. Heavy rains transformed paths into mud. Rivers complicated transportation. Disease remained a serious concern. Accommodations were often limited. Transportation networks were still developing. As thousands of Gold Rush migrants began using the route, bottlenecks quickly emerged. Travelers frequently discovered that connections between ships were far from smooth. Some found themselves waiting weeks for transportation. Others became stranded temporarily while searching for available passage. Costs often exceeded expectations. Yet despite these frustrations, many migrants continued choosing Panama because it could save valuable time. Every week mattered. In the minds of many prospectors, the richest gold deposits might already be disappearing. The sooner they arrived, the better their chances appeared. This belief created a powerful sense of urgency. Throughout 1849, people crossed oceans, rivers, plains, deserts, mountains, and jungles in pursuit of California. Few migrations in American history involved such a remarkable variety of journeys. Yet regardless of the route chosen, most travelers shared the same expectation. They believed that once they reached California, the difficult part would be over. They imagined that the true challenge would be finding gold. Many would soon discover that California itself had other lessons to teach. By the time thousands of 49ers finally reached California, many had already spent months imagining what awaited them. They had crossed continents. They had survived storms at sea. They had endured disease, exhaustion, uncertainty, and enormous expense. Throughout those long journeys, one belief often sustained them: the belief that gold would be waiting. And in a sense it was. But California in 1849 was rarely what newcomers expected. Many arrived carrying images shaped by newspaper stories and rumors. Some imagined streams glittering with gold where fortunes could be gathered almost effortlessly. Others pictured orderly settlements ready to support the growing population. Reality proved more complicated. The first surprise for many newcomers was the sheer scale of the migration. People were arriving from every direction. Americans from eastern states mixed with immigrants from Europe, Latin America, China, Australia, and the Pacific Islands. Languages filled the air. Different customs appeared side by side. California was becoming one of the most diverse places in the world. The second surprise involved prices. Nearly everything cost more than expected. Food was expensive. Clothing was expensive. Lodging was expensive. Transportation was expensive. The laws of supply and demand operated with unusual force in Gold Rush California. Thousands of people needed goods and services. Supplies often struggled to keep pace. As a result, prices climbed rapidly. A miner who arrived with limited savings could find those savings disappearing far faster than anticipated. This reality helps explain one of the most important truths of the gold rush. Finding gold was only part of the challenge. Keeping expenses under control was equally important. Some miners recovered impressive amounts of gold yet still struggled financially because the cost of living consumed much of their earnings. Others made modest discoveries but managed their resources carefully and achieved greater long-term success. California rewarded hard work, but it also rewarded planning, discipline, and adaptability. Most newcomers headed toward the gold fields of the Sierra Nevada foothills. There, rivers and streams flowing westward from the mountains had deposited gold across a broad region. During the earliest phase of the gold rush, mining methods were relatively simple. In many locations, prospectors could work independently or in small groups. The most familiar tool was the gold pan. A miner filled the pan with sediment from a stream and gently washed away lighter material. Because gold is heavy, it tended to settle at the bottom. The process required patience rather than advanced technology. When successful, it could produce exciting results. Yet it was also physically demanding. A miner might spend an entire day standing in cold water, bending repeatedly, lifting heavy material, and concentrating on small details. Success was never guaranteed. One person might discover a promising deposit. Another working only a short distance away might find very little. This uncertainty became a defining feature of mining life. Every morning offered new possibilities. Every evening brought new questions. Should a miner remain in the same location? Should he move farther upstream? Should he join a partnership? Should he try a different technique? Decisions carried consequences. And because information traveled quickly through the camps, news of a successful discovery often attracted crowds. A prospector who found a rich location could wake the next morning to discover dozens of competitors nearby. As a result, miners constantly balanced cooperation and competition. Life in the gold fields was far from comfortable. Temporary camps appeared wherever people believed gold could be found. Some consisted of only a few tents. Others rapidly expanded into bustling settlements. Buildings were often constructed quickly. Streets emerged without careful planning. Mud, dust, noise, and overcrowding became common features of many camps. Yet despite these rough conditions, communities developed. Stores opened. Blacksmiths offered services. Bakers sold bread. Doctors established practices. Entertainers sought audiences. Newspapers appeared. What began as temporary camps often evolved into functioning towns. This process happened repeatedly across the mining region. New discoveries attracted people. Businesses followed. Infrastructure gradually developed. Then, if local deposits declined, populations sometimes moved elsewhere. Entire communities could rise and fall within a few years. For newcomers, daily life revolved around work. Mining demanded time and effort. Many prospectors rose before sunrise. They prepared simple meals and headed to streams or claims. Hours passed in repetitive labor. Sediment had to be collected, washed, sorted, and examined. Tools required maintenance. Equipment occasionally failed. Weather influenced productivity. Summer heat created challenges. Winter rains transformed working conditions. The romantic image of effortless wealth rarely matched reality. Most miners worked extremely hard. Yet the possibility of success remained powerful. Stories circulated constantly. Someone had recovered a remarkable quantity of gold. Another had discovered a new deposit. A third had become wealthy almost overnight. Such stories encouraged persistence. Even when results were disappointing, many miners believed that the next day might be different. Hope became one of the most valuable resources in the gold fields. Not because hope guaranteed success, but because it motivated people to continue despite uncertainty. Interestingly, some of the most successful individuals in Gold Rush California never mined for gold at all. They recognized that miners needed supplies. They needed food. They needed tools. They needed clothing. They needed transportation. Merchants who provided these services often enjoyed more predictable profits than prospectors. One famous example was Samuel Brannan. While others searched rivers for gold, Brannan sold equipment and supplies. His business activities generated substantial wealth. Similar opportunities existed throughout California. A blacksmith might earn steady income repairing tools. A merchant could profit from selling goods. A hotel owner might benefit from growing populations. The gold rush economy extended far beyond mining itself. In fact, California was rapidly becoming a place where almost every skill had value. Carpenters found work. Farmers found markets. Teamsters transported freight. Sailors moved cargo. Professionals offered specialized services. Gold attracted people, but an entire economy emerged around their presence. And as that economy expanded, one place above all others became the center of the transformation. A small settlement on San Francisco Bay. A settlement that, within only a few years, would become one of the fastest-growing cities in the world. When many 49ers first saw San Francisco, they were looking at a city that barely seemed capable of handling its own growth. Only a few years earlier, it had been a modest settlement on a remarkable natural harbor. Now it was becoming the commercial heart of the gold rush. The transformation was so rapid that visitors often struggled to describe it. Population growth occurred at a pace rarely seen in American history. In 1848, only a small number of people lived in the town. Within a few years, tens of thousands would call it home. New arrivals reached the city almost daily. Ships entered the bay carrying passengers, cargo, and dreams of fortune. Some vessels arrived from New England. Others came from South America, Europe, China, Australia, and the islands of the Pacific. The harbor became one of the busiest places on the continent. Yet there was an unusual problem. Many sailors abandoned their ships. The reason was simple: gold. Crew members who had spent months crossing oceans suddenly discovered that mining appeared more profitable than remaining at sea. Some left immediately after arriving. Others departed before ships could even unload their cargo completely. Captains struggled to maintain crews. A number of vessels were effectively abandoned. Some remained anchored in the harbor for years. Others were repurposed as warehouses, hotels, stores, offices, or storage facilities. The shortage of labor affected nearly every industry. Workers who might have earned ordinary wages elsewhere could demand much higher compensation in California. Employers competed for employees. Opportunities seemed endless. A person willing to work could often find employment quickly. This labor shortage helps explain why California's economy expanded in so many directions. Gold may have attracted people to the region, but keeping those people fed, clothed, transported, and housed required enormous effort. Farmers supplied food. Merchants imported goods. Builders constructed homes and businesses. Teamsters hauled freight between ports and mining districts. Every successful mining camp depended on a much larger network of workers operating behind the scenes. San Francisco became the center of that network. The city functioned as a gateway. Supplies arrived there before moving inland. Information flowed through the city. Financial transactions increasingly passed through its businesses. A miner traveling to the gold fields often spent at least some time in San Francisco first. And many who arrived intending to mine eventually decided to remain in the city instead. The reason was practical. Mining offered uncertainty. Business offered stability. Consider the experience of a merchant. A miner might spend weeks searching for gold with little success. A merchant selling tools, boots, food, and clothing could profit regardless of which miners succeeded. As long as people continued arriving, demand remained strong. This dynamic created some of the greatest fortunes of the gold rush era. One famous example involved Levi Strauss. Although he would become most closely associated with California somewhat later, his story illustrates a broader pattern. Strauss did not become wealthy by digging for gold. He became successful by providing products people needed. Countless others followed similar paths. Some sold equipment. Others opened hotels. Some operated restaurants. Others transported goods. California's economy quickly became more complex than many newcomers expected. The gold rush was never only about mining. It was also about commerce. As San Francisco expanded, the physical appearance of the city changed continuously. New buildings appeared. Roads improved. Wharves extended into the harbor. Businesses occupied nearly every available space. Construction occurred so rapidly that maps became outdated almost immediately. Visitors often remarked that areas empty one month could be crowded the next. Yet rapid growth also created problems. Housing shortages were common. Sanitation struggled to keep pace with population increases. Fire represented a constant danger. Many structures were built quickly from wood. Buildings stood close together. A single spark could threaten entire sections of the city. These concerns proved well-founded. During the early 1850s, San Francisco suffered a series of devastating fires. Some destroyed large portions of the city. Businesses burned. Homes disappeared. Economic losses mounted. Yet each time, rebuilding began almost immediately. The determination to rebuild reflected confidence in California's future. Residents believed the city would continue growing. And they were correct. Even disasters failed to halt expansion. Another challenge involved law and order. Gold Rush California experienced rapid population growth before many institutions had fully developed. Courts, police systems, and local governments often struggled to keep pace. Theft occurred. Fraud occurred. Violent crime sometimes occurred. Most residents desired stability, but creating effective institutions required time. Communities experimented with different solutions. Local governments expanded. Courts became more active. Citizens occasionally organized committees to address crime when official systems appeared inadequate. The process was often imperfect. Yet over time, stronger institutions emerged. This evolution reflected a broader transition taking place across California. The region was gradually moving beyond its earliest frontier phase. Temporary camps were becoming permanent communities. Businesses were investing in long-term growth. Families were arriving. Schools, churches, and civic organizations appeared. California was beginning to resemble a settled society rather than a collection of mining camps. Meanwhile, the population itself continued becoming more diverse. Ships arriving in San Francisco brought people from around the world. Different languages could be heard in the streets. Different traditions shaped neighborhoods and businesses. Opportunities attracted migrants from many backgrounds. Yet diversity also created tensions. Competition for jobs and resources sometimes produced conflict. Prejudice and discrimination were present. Not everyone benefited equally from California's growth. These realities would become increasingly important as migration continued. Among the groups arriving during this period were thousands of immigrants from China. Their experiences would play a major role in the history of the gold rush and in the broader history of the American West. And their story reveals both the opportunities and the challenges that accompanied California's extraordinary transformation. In the spring of 1852, a young man stood on the deck of a ship approaching California. Ahead of him lay San Francisco Bay. Behind him lay a village in southern China that he might not see again for many years. Like thousands of others making the same journey, he carried very few possessions. But he carried enormous expectations. His family had helped finance the voyage. Relatives had contributed savings. Neighbors had offered encouragement. Everyone hoped that California would provide opportunities unavailable at home. To many Chinese migrants, California was known as the Gold Mountain. The name captured the imagination. It suggested wealth, possibility, and a chance to improve one's future. Yet as the ship entered the harbor, the reality awaiting newcomers was far more complicated than the stories that had crossed the Pacific. To understand why so many Chinese migrants came to California, it is helpful to consider conditions in China during the mid-19th century. Many regions faced economic difficulties. Population growth increased pressure on farmland. Competition for resources intensified. Natural disasters sometimes created additional hardship. Political instability added uncertainty to daily life. For many families, opportunities seemed limited. Migration offered an alternative. A successful worker abroad could send money home. Even modest earnings might improve the lives of relatives thousands of miles away. As news of the gold rush spread through coastal communities, California became one of several destinations attracting attention. The journey was expensive. For many migrants, the cost represented years of savings. Some borrowed money. Others entered arrangements requiring them to repay debts after finding work. As a result, the decision to leave home carried significant risk. Failure would affect not only the traveler but also the family depending upon him. After arriving in California, many Chinese migrants initially entered the mining districts. The work they encountered was familiar in some ways and unfamiliar in others. Like other miners, they woke early. They searched streams. They dug gravel. They carried equipment. They endured disappointment and uncertainty. The rivers did not care where a miner had been born. Gold remained difficult for everyone to find. Yet Chinese miners often approached their work with remarkable discipline. Observers frequently noted their willingness to work claims that others had abandoned. Areas considered exhausted sometimes still contained small amounts of gold. Through patience and careful methods, Chinese mining groups occasionally recovered profits from places that earlier prospectors had overlooked. Cooperation played an important role. Many migrants traveled with friends, relatives, or people from the same region. Shared language and cultural traditions helped newcomers adapt to unfamiliar surroundings. Communities provided support. Information circulated. Resources were shared. In a world filled with uncertainty, these networks offered stability. Yet life in California was not easy. Economic competition increased throughout the 1850s. The richest surface deposits had become harder to find. More miners were competing for fewer opportunities. Under such conditions, resentment often emerged. Unfortunately, immigrants frequently became targets. Chinese communities faced discrimination that affected many aspects of daily life. Special taxes were sometimes imposed on foreign miners. Local regulations could be enforced unevenly. Violence occasionally occurred. Some individuals blamed immigrants for economic difficulties that had much deeper causes. These experiences were painful, but they were not unique to California. Throughout history, periods of rapid migration and economic uncertainty have often produced similar tensions. What makes the California story significant is that these tensions unfolded within one of the most important migration events in American history. Despite obstacles, Chinese immigrants continued contributing to California's development. Many gradually recognized that mining was only one possibility. Some entered agriculture. Others opened stores. Some worked in construction. Others provided services within growing towns and cities. As California's economy diversified, Chinese workers became part of numerous industries. A traveler walking through San Francisco during the 1850s would have encountered evidence of these communities. Chinese-owned businesses appeared in commercial districts. Imported goods connected California to markets across the Pacific. New neighborhoods developed. Familiar foods, customs, and traditions helped immigrants maintain connections to home while adapting to a new environment. The creation of these communities required resilience. Many migrants expected to stay only temporarily. Their goal was often simple: earn money, support family members, return home. Yet life rarely follows simple plans. Some eventually returned to China. Others remained in California for decades. Many discovered that their futures had become tied to the American West. Their experiences formed part of a larger pattern. The gold rush was not merely an American event. It was a global event. People crossed oceans to participate. Capital moved between continents. Information traveled through international networks. California became one of the most diverse places in the world. This diversity contributed to its growth. Different skills, traditions, and experiences enriched the developing economy. Yet diversity also created challenges. Communities negotiated questions of identity, belonging, and opportunity. These questions would continue shaping California long after the gold rush ended. Meanwhile, conditions in the mining regions were changing once again. The era of individual prospectors working simple claims was gradually fading. Surface deposits had become less abundant. Competition remained intense. Investors were increasingly interested in methods capable of extracting gold on a larger scale. The future of mining would depend less on luck and more on technology, organization, and capital. California's landscape itself was about to be transformed in pursuit of gold. For the earliest 49ers, mining often meant working with simple tools. A pan, a shovel, perhaps a pickaxe. A miner could walk to a stream, begin digging, and hope that luck would provide a reward. By the early 1850s, that world was beginning to disappear. The California gold rush was entering a new phase. Gold still attracted dreamers. But increasingly, success depended upon something more than individual effort. It depended upon money. It depended upon organization. And it depended upon technology. Imagine a miner arriving in California in 1853. He has heard stories from relatives who came several years earlier. They described rivers filled with opportunity. They spoke of nuggets lying in streambeds. They remembered a time when a determined individual might establish a claim and immediately begin working. What he discovers instead is a landscape that has already changed. The richest and most accessible deposits in many areas have been worked repeatedly. Thousands of people have searched the same rivers. The easiest gold has often already been collected. Opportunity still exists. But finding it requires greater effort. This reality encouraged innovation. Miners experimented with new methods designed to process larger amounts of earth. One important development involved sluice boxes. These long wooden channels used flowing water to separate gold from lighter material. Instead of processing a single pan at a time, miners could work much larger quantities of gravel. The technique improved efficiency. More earth could be examined. More gold could potentially be recovered. The principle was simple. Gold is heavy. When water carried sand and gravel through a sluice, the heavier gold tended to settle while lighter material continued downstream. The method saved time. It also encouraged larger operations. Groups of miners often cooperated because constructing and operating equipment required resources beyond what many individuals possessed. This trend appeared throughout the mining districts. Partnerships expanded. Investors supplied capital. Labor became increasingly organized. The image of the solitary prospector remained popular, but California's mining industry was becoming far more complex. The most dramatic transformation involved hydraulic mining. To appreciate its impact, imagine standing in a quiet valley in the Sierra Nevada foothills. Trees cover the hillsides. Streams wind through the landscape. Then imagine powerful jets of water blasting directly into those hills. Earth collapses. Gravel rushes downward. Entire sections of terrain are washed away. This was hydraulic mining. The method used water delivered through pipes under tremendous pressure. The force could tear apart hillsides that would have required years of manual labor to excavate. To investors, the technology appeared revolutionary. Gold that had once been difficult to reach could now be accessed much more efficiently. Production increased. Large mining companies expanded. Capital flowed into the industry. For a time, hydraulic mining seemed to represent the future. Yet every technological advance carries consequences. The same water that washed away hillsides also carried enormous quantities of sediment into rivers. Streams became clogged. Riverbeds rose. Flooding became a growing concern in some regions. Farmers living downstream began noticing changes. Fields were damaged. Waterways behaved differently. Conflicts emerged between agricultural communities and mining interests. The dispute reflected a broader question. How should a society balance economic growth against environmental costs? Today, such debates are common. During the gold rush, people were confronting similar issues in an earlier form. Many miners focused primarily on immediate opportunity. A rich deposit promised jobs, income, and investment. Others worried about long-term consequences. Both perspectives had merit, and the tension between them would remain part of California's history. While technology transformed the mining regions, another revolution was taking place in California's towns and cities. The economy was becoming more sophisticated. During the earliest days of the gold rush, a miner might pay for supplies using gold dust. Merchants weighed the gold and estimated its value. The process worked, but it was not ideal. Purity varied. Measurements could be inconsistent. Security remained a constant concern. As commerce expanded, people demanded better systems. Banks became increasingly important. Assayers tested gold and determined its quality. Financial institutions provided services that made trade more predictable. A merchant purchasing inventory wanted confidence in payment. An investor financing a mining operation wanted reliable records. An economy built entirely upon informal exchanges could not support long-term growth. One company that emerged during this period was Wells, Fargo and Company. Its services helped transport gold, money, and correspondence across vast distances. Such businesses rarely attracted the same attention as dramatic mining discoveries. Yet they played an essential role. Without transportation networks, communication systems, and financial institutions, California's growth would have been far slower. In many respects, the real story of the 1850s was not simply about finding gold. It was about building the structures necessary to manage the wealth that gold created. Roads improved. Warehouses expanded. Ports grew busier. Businesses invested for the future. The frontier economy was gradually becoming a mature economy. And as that transformation continued, California found itself confronting questions that reached far beyond mining. The state was growing rapidly. Its population was expanding. Its influence was increasing. And political leaders across the United States were beginning to realize that California's future would affect the future of the nation itself. In September of 1850, less than 3 years after gold had been discovered at Sutter's mill, California officially became the 31st state of the United States. The speed of that transformation was astonishing. Only a short time earlier, California had been a distant frontier at the edge of the continent. Now it was one of the fastest-growing regions in the nation. To people living through those years, events often felt as though history itself had begun moving faster. A merchant arriving in San Francisco in 1849 might return several years later and struggle to recognize parts of the city. Entire neighborhoods had appeared. Businesses had multiplied. Population growth had exceeded almost every prediction. Yet California's admission to the Union involved far more than local growth. It became part of one of the most important political debates in American history. To understand why, we must briefly leave the mining camps and travel east to Washington, D.C. During the middle decades of the 19th century, the United States was expanding rapidly. New territories were being added. Settlers were moving west. Land that had once been considered distant frontier was becoming part of the national political system. Every expansion created a difficult question. Would slavery be allowed in the new territory? Or would it be prohibited? This issue dominated American politics. Southern states wanted to protect their political influence. Northern states wanted to limit the expansion of slavery. Each new state had the potential to shift the balance of power. When California sought admission to the Union, these concerns immediately surfaced. The gold rush had attracted people from many backgrounds, but California's economy was not based on plantation agriculture. Its leaders drafted a constitution that prohibited slavery. For many Americans, this seemed like a straightforward local decision. For politicians in Washington, it became a national controversy. Debates grew intense. Compromises were proposed. Warnings about sectional conflict became increasingly common. The result was a broader political agreement known as the Compromise of 1850. The compromise addressed several disputes involving slavery and Western expansion. California entered the Union as a free state. At the time, many political leaders hoped the compromise would ease tensions and preserve national unity. For a few years, it appeared to succeed. Yet the underlying disagreements remained unresolved. Within a decade, those tensions would contribute to the outbreak of the American Civil War. The gold rush therefore influenced American politics in ways that reached far beyond California itself. Most miners, however, spent little time thinking about constitutional debates in Washington. Their concerns were usually more immediate: food prices, claim disputes, weather, health, work. Yet statehood still affected daily life. Stable government encouraged investment. Businesses preferred predictable legal systems. Property rights became clearer. Courts expanded. Public institutions became stronger. These changes helped transform California from a temporary boom region into a permanent part of the United States. For ordinary residents, this transformation was visible in many small ways. Roads improved. Schools appeared. Local governments expanded services. Communities developed long-term plans rather than focusing solely on immediate survival. A miner who initially expected to stay for a few months might now begin considering a different future. Perhaps he would open a store. Perhaps he would purchase land. Perhaps he would bring his family west. California increasingly appeared not merely as a place to find gold but as a place to build a life. Yet despite this growing stability, uncertainty remained everywhere. Walk through a mining district in the early 1850s and you would encounter countless personal stories unfolding simultaneously. One miner has finally found a productive claim after months of disappointment. Another has exhausted his savings. A merchant is expanding his business. A farmer is supplying food to nearby camps. A newly arrived immigrant is trying to understand an unfamiliar society. California offered opportunity. But it offered no guarantees. Historians often note that the gold rush created extraordinary social mobility. Individuals could improve their circumstances in ways that might have been difficult elsewhere. Yet the opposite was also true. People could lose money, health, and years of effort pursuing dreams that never materialized. The contrast between expectation and reality remained one of the defining features of the era. Newspaper readers in New York, London, Paris, and Shanghai often encountered stories about spectacular fortunes. Such stories were exciting. They sold newspapers. They encouraged migration. But the average experience was usually less dramatic. Most residents of Gold Rush, California lived somewhere between triumph and failure. They worked hard. They adapted. They endured uncertainty. And through their collective efforts, they helped create a new society. As California matured, another reality was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The state's rapid growth had come at a tremendous cost to many indigenous communities. While newcomers celebrated opportunity and prosperity, native peoples across California were experiencing one of the most devastating periods in their history. To understand the true legacy of the gold rush, their story must be told as well. Imagine living beside a California river in 1847. The seasons are familiar. The landscape is familiar. The routes used for hunting, fishing, and gathering have been known for generations. Families understand the rhythms of the land because their ancestors have lived there for centuries. Then, within only a few years, everything changes. Thousands of strangers begin arriving. Trails become roads. Quiet valleys become mining districts. Rivers fill with prospectors. Forests echo with the sounds of construction. What had once been a local world becomes part of a global migration. For many native communities, this was the reality of the gold rush. Long before the arrival of Spanish explorers, California had been home to one of the most culturally diverse indigenous regions in North America. Hundreds of communities occupied the territory. Languages varied from region to region. Customs differed. Economic practices differed. Political structures differed. Yet despite this diversity, many communities shared a close relationship with the natural environment. Rivers, forests, coastlines, and valleys provided the resources necessary for daily life. By the time gold was discovered in 1848, indigenous societies had already experienced profound disruption. Spanish missions had altered traditional ways of life. Disease had reduced populations. Mexican rule brought additional changes. Yet native communities remained present throughout California. The gold rush introduced a new and unprecedented wave of pressure. The speed of migration was unlike anything the region had previously experienced. Hundreds of thousands of newcomers entered California within only a few years. Mining camps appeared in places that had recently been quiet landscapes. Settlements expanded rapidly. Land use changed. Competition for resources intensified. For indigenous communities, the consequences were immediate. Many traditional food sources became less reliable. Fishing areas were disturbed. Wildlife patterns changed. Waterways were altered by mining activity. Places that had sustained communities for generations became increasingly difficult to access. Imagine watching a familiar river transformed into a crowded industrial workplace. Miners dig along the banks. Equipment fills the water. Trees are cut nearby. Sediment clouds the current. The river remains physically present, yet its role within the landscape has changed dramatically. This experience occurred across many regions of California. Disease represented another devastating challenge. Throughout the history of the Americas, indigenous populations suffered heavily from illnesses introduced by outsiders. California was no exception. Increased migration created new opportunities for disease transmission. Communities that lacked immunity often experienced severe losses. The consequences extended beyond population decline. Knowledge was lost. Families were disrupted. Social structures were weakened. Yet disease alone does not explain the scale of suffering experienced during the Gold Rush era. Violence also played a significant role. Competition over land and resources frequently produced conflict. Some settlers viewed native communities as obstacles to expansion. Attacks occurred. Villages were destroyed. People were forced from their homes. In some regions, organized campaigns targeted indigenous populations. The details varied from place to place, but the overall pattern is clear. The Gold Rush coincided with a catastrophic decline in California's native population. Modern historians continue examining the full extent of these events. New research regularly expands our understanding. Yet there is broad agreement regarding the human cost. For many indigenous communities, the Gold Rush was not a story of opportunity. It was a story of displacement, survival, and resilience. Resilience is an important word here. Because despite extraordinary hardships, native peoples endured. Communities adapted. Families preserved traditions. Cultural knowledge survived. Languages survived in some areas despite enormous pressure. The history of California's indigenous peoples did not end during the Gold Rush. It continued into the modern era, and it remains an essential part of California's story today. Understanding this perspective changes how we view the Gold Rush itself. The event becomes more complex. It is no longer only a story about migration, wealth, and economic growth. It is also a story about competing experiences. The same development that created opportunity for one group sometimes created hardship for another. History often works this way. Major events rarely affect everyone equally. While native communities struggled to adapt to rapid change, California's economy continued expanding. Gold extracted from rivers and mountains traveled far beyond the mining districts where it had been found. Some of it entered banks. Some entered international trade. Some financed new businesses and infrastructure projects. California's gold was helping connect the Pacific coast to global economic networks. A merchant in New York might never visit California, yet still benefit from economic activity generated there. Investors in Europe followed developments closely. Traders across the Pacific recognized new opportunities. The Gold Rush had begun as a local discovery. It had become an international phenomenon. By the late 1850s, California was no longer simply a place where people searched for gold. It was becoming one of the most important economic regions in North America. And increasingly, its future depended not on mining alone, but on the broader society and economy that had emerged around the rush. By the late 1850s, a visitor returning to California after several years away would have noticed something important. The excitement remained. Gold was still being mined. People still arrived hoping to improve their fortunes. Yet the atmosphere had changed. The California of 1858 was not the California of 1849. The frantic rush that had followed the discovery at Sutter's mill was gradually giving way to something more permanent. The state was growing up. This change could be seen in countless small details. Roads were better than they had been during the earliest years. Towns that had once consisted of tents and rough wooden structures now contained brick buildings and established businesses. Schools appeared. Churches expanded. Local governments became more organized. People who had originally intended to stay only a few months were beginning to realize that California might become their home. Consider a miner who arrived in 1849. When he first stepped onto California soil, his plan may have been simple. Find gold. Earn a fortune. Return east. A decade later, he might still be there. Not because he had become wealthy through mining, but because his life had taken an unexpected direction. Perhaps he opened a store. Perhaps he purchased farmland. Perhaps he married and started a family. Such stories became increasingly common. For many residents, California's greatest opportunities were no longer found in riverbeds. They were found in the communities growing around them. Agriculture offers a powerful example. During the earliest phase of the gold rush, food shortages had been common. Mining camps consumed enormous quantities of supplies. Merchants imported food from distant locations whenever possible. But California possessed fertile land capable of supporting large-scale agriculture. As population increased, farmers recognized the opportunity. Fields expanded. Ranches grew. Local food production became increasingly important. A farmer who consistently supplied growing communities could earn a stable income year after year. Unlike mining, agriculture did not depend upon discovering hidden deposits. It depended upon land, labor, and planning. Many former miners eventually concluded that farming offered a more predictable future. The same pattern appeared in other industries. Construction expanded. Transportation services grew. Manufacturing increased. Warehouses, shipping companies, and financial institutions all benefited from California's development. A modern observer might describe this process as economic diversification. The state's prosperity was becoming less dependent on gold alone. This transition proved crucial. History contains many examples of boom regions that declined after their primary resource became less profitable. California followed a different path. Gold attracted people. But the broader economy convinced many of them to stay. The state's future rested upon far more than mining. The changing character of California could also be seen in its population. The earliest gold rush years had been dominated by young men seeking opportunity. By the late 1850s, the population was becoming more balanced. Families increased. Permanent neighborhoods expanded. Community institutions became stronger. The social fabric of the state was becoming more complex and more stable. Yet reminders of the gold rush remained everywhere. Travelers still encountered mining camps. Rivers still attracted prospectors. New discoveries occasionally generated excitement. Rumors of rich deposits continued spreading through newspapers and conversations. Hope remained one of California's most valuable commodities. People still believed that success might be waiting just beyond the next ridge or around the next bend in the river. Some even left established occupations to pursue new discoveries. The dream remained alive. But increasingly it existed alongside practical realities. Californians were learning that long-term prosperity often came from persistence rather than sudden fortune. Not every town benefited equally from these changes. Some communities flourished. Others declined. Mining settlements often experienced dramatic cycles. A rich claim could attract thousands of people. Businesses opened. Buildings appeared. Optimism filled the air. Then production slowed. Miners departed. Customers disappeared. Stores closed. Within a few years, a thriving settlement might become nearly deserted. Across California, the landscape became dotted with such places. Some eventually disappeared altogether. Others survived as small communities. These settlements remind us how closely fortunes were tied to the availability of resources. They also reveal the uncertainty that remained at the heart of frontier life. Success was never guaranteed. Even prosperous communities understood this reality. By the end of the decade, however, one fact was clear. California had moved beyond the earliest stage of the gold rush. The state was no longer merely a destination for fortune seekers. It had become an economic powerhouse on the Pacific coast. Its ports connected international markets. Its farms supplied growing populations. Its businesses attracted investment. Its influence extended far beyond its borders. The discovery of gold had begun the transformation. But the society that emerged afterward was proving even more important. In many ways, the greatest legacy of the gold rush was not the wealth extracted from rivers and mountains. It was the creation of a new center of economic and political power in the American West. And that new center would soon play an increasingly important role in shaping the future of the United States itself. By the early 1860s, the California gold rush had largely faded from newspaper headlines. Gold was still being mined. Mining companies continued operating. Prospectors still searched remote valleys and mountain streams. Yet the extraordinary frenzy that had defined 1849 no longer dominated public attention. For many people, the gold rush seemed like a completed chapter. History, however, often works differently. The most important consequences of major events frequently appear after the excitement has passed. This was certainly true in California. To appreciate the scale of the transformation, imagine comparing two maps. The first map shows California in 1848. The second shows California little more than a decade later. The difference would be astonishing. Population had increased dramatically. Cities had expanded. Transportation networks had improved. Commercial activity had multiplied. A region once considered distant and isolated had become one of the most dynamic parts of the United States. The gold rush helped accelerate this transformation. But it also influenced developments far beyond California itself. One of the clearest examples involved transportation. Before the gold rush, reaching the Pacific coast required patience, endurance, and significant resources. The journey could consume months. Travelers crossed deserts, mountains, oceans, and tropical jungles. Distance shaped every aspect of life. Communication was slow. Trade was difficult. National integration remained incomplete. The rapid growth of California changed how Americans thought about these challenges. A prosperous Pacific coast created pressure for better connections with the rest of the country. Merchants wanted faster transportation. Politicians wanted stronger national links. Families wanted easier travel. Businesses wanted more efficient communication. As a result, support grew for projects that would reduce the practical distance between California and the eastern United States. Among the most important was the Transcontinental Railroad. The dream of linking the continent by rail existed before the gold rush. Yet California's growth made the project far more urgent. A state with hundreds of thousands of residents and increasing economic importance could not remain permanently dependent upon slow transportation routes. The railroad would eventually connect oceans, shorten travel times dramatically, and transform commerce. When it was completed in 1869, it represented one of the greatest engineering achievements of the 19th century. The gold rush did not build the railroad by itself. But it helped create the conditions that made such an undertaking seem necessary. Communication improved as well. Mail services expanded. Telegraph lines extended westward. Information traveled more quickly than ever before. A business decision that once required months of correspondence could increasingly be managed in days. These changes made California feel less distant. The Pacific Coast was becoming fully integrated into national life. The economy reflected similar trends. Gold discoveries increased the supply of precious metal available to financial systems. Banks expanded. Investment opportunities multiplied. Commercial networks grew more sophisticated. California became an important center of trade connecting North America, Latin America, Asia, and the Pacific world. San Francisco played a particularly significant role. Its harbor connected the American West to international markets. Ships arrived carrying goods, passengers, and information from around the globe. The city that had once been a small settlement evolved into one of the most important ports on the Pacific. This growth influenced migration patterns as well. Before 1848, relatively few Americans lived on the Pacific coast. After the gold rush, Western settlement accelerated. California demonstrated that large populations could thrive far from the traditional centers of American power. The idea of the West changed. What had once seemed remote and uncertain increasingly appeared accessible and full of opportunity. This shift would influence migration for generations. The gold rush also helped shape American culture. Stories about 49ers entered popular memory. Books described dramatic journeys. Newspapers celebrated discoveries. Artists painted scenes of mining camps and frontier landscapes. Later generations would encounter these stories through novels, films, and historical accounts. The gold rush became part of the mythology of the American West. Yet myths often simplify complicated realities. The popular image emphasized adventure, independence, and sudden wealth. Those elements certainly existed. But they were only part of the story. The complete history also includes environmental change. It includes discrimination and conflict. It includes the suffering experienced by many native communities. It includes failure alongside success. Modern historians increasingly emphasize these complexities. Rather than viewing the gold rush as purely heroic or purely tragic, they examine it as a multifaceted event that affected different groups in different ways. This approach provides a richer understanding of the past. It reminds us that history is rarely simple. The California gold rush generated extraordinary opportunities. It also created significant costs. Both realities existed simultaneously. Perhaps that complexity explains why the subject continues to fascinate people around the world. Few events transformed a region so quickly. Few events attracted migrants from so many countries. Few events connected economics, politics, technology, migration, culture, and the environment so completely. The discovery at Sutter's Mill was a local event. The consequences became global. And more than a century and a half later, those consequences can still be seen across California and throughout the United States. On a quiet January morning in 1848, James Marshall noticed something unusual in the waters of a mill race near the American River. At the time, neither he nor John Sutter fully understood what would follow. The discovery appeared small. A few bright pieces of metal. A moment of curiosity. An attempt to determine whether the material was truly gold. Yet history often turns on moments that seem insignificant when they occur. The California gold rush began with the discovery. But its lasting importance lies in everything that followed. Within a remarkably short period of time, people crossed oceans and continents in pursuit of opportunity. Ships crowded distant harbors. Wagon trains crossed vast plains. Families made difficult decisions. Young men left home. Entrepreneurs invested savings. Immigrants traveled thousands of miles toward uncertain futures. California became a destination for dreamers from around the world. Some achieved the success they sought. Others did not. Yet almost everyone who participated became part of a transformation larger than themselves. Gold changed individual lives. More importantly, it changed a region. Before 1848, California occupied a relatively modest place within the broader American imagination. After the gold rush, it became one of the most important regions in North America. Population increased dramatically. Cities expanded. Farms multiplied. Businesses flourished. Transportation networks improved. Institutions matured. What had once been a distant frontier evolved into a center of economic and political influence. The transformation occurred with astonishing speed. Yet speed alone does not explain why the gold rush remains so memorable. Many regions have experienced resource booms. Many communities have pursued wealth. What makes California unique is the extraordinary combination of migration, diversity, ambition, and change. Few places attracted people from so many different backgrounds in such a short period of time. Americans arrived from eastern states. Immigrants arrived from Europe. Travelers crossed the Pacific from Asia. Communities from Latin America contributed their labor, knowledge, and traditions. Languages mixed. Cultures interacted. New relationships formed. California became a meeting place for the wider world. This diversity helped shape the state's future. It also revealed the challenges of building a society from so many different experiences and expectations. Opportunity existed. So did conflict. Prosperity existed. So did inequality. These contrasts appear throughout the history of the gold rush. Some individuals accumulated great wealth. Others struggled merely to survive. Some communities expanded rapidly. Others disappeared. The event produced winners and losers, often in ways that nobody could have predicted in advance. The experiences of native Californians remind us of this reality. For many indigenous communities, the gold rush brought disruption, displacement, violence, and loss. Their story is inseparable from the broader history of the era. Understanding the gold rush requires acknowledging both the opportunities it created and the hardships it imposed. History becomes more meaningful when all perspectives are considered. The environmental legacy remains important as well. Rivers were altered. Hillsides were reshaped. Forests changed. The pursuit of wealth left visible marks on the landscape. Even today, traces of 19th-century mining activity can still be found in parts of California. The land remembers. In many ways, the gold rush foreshadowed themes that continue to shape the modern world. Rapid migration. Economic opportunity. Technological innovation. Environmental consequences. Cultural exchange. Competition for resources. These subjects remain familiar because they continue influencing societies today. The California Gold Rush was a 19th century event. Yet many of its lessons feel surprisingly modern. Perhaps the most enduring lesson concerns human ambition. People crossed deserts, oceans, mountains, and continents because they believed their lives could be improved. Some sought wealth. Others sought independence. Some hoped to support families. Others hoped to reinvent themselves entirely. Their motivations differed, but they shared a belief in possibility. That belief helped build roads, towns, businesses, and communities. It helped transform California. And it helped shape the American West. As the years passed, the rivers yielded less gold. The Great Rush gradually ended. Camps emptied. Prospectors moved on. New opportunities emerged elsewhere. Yet California did not fade. The society created during the gold rush continued growing. The cities remained. The farms remained. The ports remained. The institutions remained. The state that emerged from the gold rush would go on to influence commerce, culture, technology, agriculture, and politics on a global scale. Looking back from the present, it is tempting to focus only on the glitter of gold itself. But the true legacy of the California gold rush was never merely the metal pulled from streams and mountains. Its true legacy was the creation of a new world on the Pacific coast. A world built by countless individuals whose journeys, hopes, struggles, and decisions combined to change history. And so, as the campfires fade, as the ships drift quietly in distant memory, and as the rivers continue their steady flow toward the sea, the story of the California gold rush comes to a close. Not as a tale of gold alone, but as a story of people, and of the remarkable transformation they helped create.